night air clung to the ancient stone walls of Pendleton Hall like a shroud, chilling every corridor with a damp, creeping cold. The grand estate, perched atop the craggy cliffs overlooking the restless sea, had always been a place where whispers lingered longer than they should. Tonight, those whispers had taken a darker tone. Lord Pendleton himself, usually a man of exacting habits and meticulous routines, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the servants had discovered a scene that defied all logic. His study door locked from the inside, the window latched, and yet the room held a single, inexplicable clue. A chess piece, a black knight, positioned precisely in the centre of the polished mahogany desk. No other sign of struggle, no note, no forced entry. Just the black knight, standing sentinel over an absence that felt unnervingly deliberate. The household had been thrown into disarray. Lady Eleanor, Lord Pendleton's niece and heir to the estate, hovered by the doorway with a trembling hand pressed to her lips. "It doesn't make sense," she whispered, voice barely carrying over the ticking of the grandfather clock. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. No one could have entered. And yet, he's gone. Her eyes flicked to the chess piece, as if expecting it to speak. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, some muttering about ghosts or old curses, others simply bewildered by the impossibility of the situation. A locked-room disappearance was a rare enough phenomenon, but the element of that singular chess piece transformed it from curious to sinister. By the time the local constable arrived, a drizzle had begun, turning the stone paths slick and reflective, the dim lamplight shimmering in the wet sheen. Constable Harris, a man accustomed to petty theft and drunken brawls rather than baffling vanishings, frowned as he examined the study. He tested the lock with a key, listened at the door, even pressed his ear to the window, but all indicated that the room was, in fact, impervious from the outside. "No one could have entered," he muttered, echoing Lady Eleanor's fear, though he tried to sound practical. Unless someone is hiding in plain sight." He glanced around as if the walls themselves might betray a secret compartment, a hidden passage, some trick of architecture that could explain the absence. The hallways of Pendleton Hall were labyrinthine, each corridor twisting into the next with the inevitability of a tide. Candles flickered against tapestries depicting long-forgotten battles and stern ancestors, who seemed to frown at the very idea of disorder. Harris checked each room in methodical sequence, finding nothing unusual except for the occasional draught that seemed to originate from nowhere. The study, however, remained the enigma. The chess piece, small and unassuming, had been cleaned until it gleamed unnaturally under the candlelight, and yet no fingerprints or smudges indicated anyone's presence. Its placement suggested deliberation, as if the piece itself were a message, and yet no one could decipher what message a solitary black knight could convey. Lady Eleanor insisted on showing Harris every inch of the room. The desk drawers were meticulously organized, the bookshelves aligned with almost obsessive precision, and the fireplace, though cold, bore no sign of recent use. Even the ink pots and pens were untouched. It was a room in perfect order, yet it radiated absence, the absence of Lord Pendleton and the absence of explanation. "He had no enemies," she said, her voice steadier now, though shadows darkened her pale face. "Everyone loved him. He was careful, meticulous, thoughtful. If anyone could vanish without a trace, it would be him, but I can't imagine why." As Harris scratched his head, turning the chess piece between his fingers, he heard the faintest of noises, a low creak, almost imperceptible, like wood straining under weight. He paused, listening, but the sound did not repeat. Lady Eleanor leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the black knight. "It's not just a piece," she said, suddenly certain. "He always played chess, always, and he never left a game unfinished." Her words lingered in the room like a warning. Could the chess piece be a symbol, a clue left by Lord Pendleton himself? Or was it a mockery, a cruel hint from someone who wanted them to puzzle over an impossible scenario? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling shutters and bending trees against the rocky cliffs. Harris made a note to himself to return in daylight, to inspect the architecture more closely, to search for hidden passages or secret exits. But something about the scene gnawed at him, a sense that the puzzle was far from physical. The chess piece suggested strategy, planning, a mind thinking several moves ahead. Whoever or whatever was responsible had anticipated every conventional investigation, every logical search. Even the most meticulous constable could not hope to grasp it fully, not yet. The servants whispered among themselves, fearful eyes darting toward the study, as if it might erupt with answers at any moment. One young maid, timid and pale, spoke of hearing the faintest of footsteps in the corridor just before midnight, though no one could place their source. Another claimed to have glimpsed a shadow in the window, but when she turned, it vanished as if swallowed by the night. Each testimony was fragmentary, contradictory, and tantalizing. Harris recorded them dutifully, but he felt the weight of their unease pressing against the edges of reason. It was a crime that defied standard explanation, a vanishing act calculated to unsettle even the most grounded mind. By the time the night deepened and candles guttered low, the hall seemed to exhale, a slow, mournful sigh that carried through every chamber. Harris, exhausted and frustrated, stepped back from the study one last time. The chess piece gleamed, almost, mocking, a silent sentinel over an enigma that refused to bend to logic. "Impossible," he muttered again, though the word tasted hollow. Outside, the storm began to batter the cliffs with a relentless rhythm, the sound echoing like footsteps running just out of reach. Inside, Pendleton Hall remained suspended between fear and anticipation, a place where reason faltered and the mind wandered into shadowed corners. It was at that moment, in the thick silence of the hall, that a quiet, almost imperceptible thought struck Harris, one he could neither dismiss nor fully articulate. The solution, if there was one, would not be found by brute force or simple observation. It would require understanding the mind behind the act, the intent cloaked beneath the surface of impossibility. And somewhere, in the stillness of Pendleton Hall, that mind was waiting. By dawn, a strange unease had settled over the estate. The wind had died down, leaving the stone walls slick with rain and the corridors eerily silent. Harris sat by the fireplace in the drawing-room, cataloguing his observations, glancing again and again at the Black Knight, now moved to the mantel at Lady Eleanor's insistence. Its small shadow flickered in the morning light, and he realized that it had been the only constant in a night of impossibilities. Somehow, it seemed to hum with significance, a cipher waiting to be decoded. The question remained, was it a key, a warning, or a riddle meant to confound those who dared to seek the truth? And so, Lord Pendleton's study remained empty, the Black Knight immovable, and the hallways of Pendleton Hall held their breath, as if waiting for someone perceptive enough to see beyond the impossible, to decipher the midnight pact that had left a man vanished, a family terrified, and a constable grasping at shadows. Somewhere within those stone walls the first move had been made. The game and the mystery had begun. The following morning, the fog clung stubbornly to the cliffs around Pendleton Hall, obscuring the jagged rocks below and giving the estate the appearance of floating in a grey, silent void. Constable Harris paced the drawing-room, trying to reconcile the impossibility of the night before with the mundane realities of police work. His ledger of observations was thorough but incomplete, and the absence of Lord Pendleton gnawed at him with a persistence that made every tick of the grandfather clock sound like a rebuke. He sighed, aware that his experience with simple thefts and domestic disputes had ill-prepared him for the intricacies of a disappearance designed to confound. It was then that Miss Jane Marple arrived, stepping lightly into the hall with the unassuming poise of someone who belonged neither to the upper echelons of society nor the rigidity of law enforcement, yet who commanded attention simply by the precision of her observation. Her eyes, sharp and subtle, scanned the room with a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle the constable, though he would not admit it aloud. She carried no tools, no ostentatious kit, only a small leather satchel and a notebook, whose pages were filled with notes, diagrams, and the occasional careful sketch. Her presence seemed to straighten the room itself. The disorderly hum of unease among the servants softened, and Lady Eleanor, still pale from the night's events, straightened in her chair as if sensing that someone had arrived who might make sense of the impossible. Miss Marple moved toward the fireplace, inspecting the mantel where the Black Knight now rested. She lifted the piece delicately, rotating it between nimble fingers, her eyes narrowing not in wonder but in calculation. A solitary knight, she murmured almost to herself, placed deliberately. Not a pawn, not a queen, but a knight, strategy, mobility, and the capacity to strike unexpectedly. A mind that delights in riddles has left a calling card. But why here? Why now? Her voice, soft yet precise, seemed to carry a weight that made Harris shift uneasily. The constable had not considered the symbolism. To him, it was an object. To Miss Marple, it was a statement. She walked slowly around the study, allowing her gaze to drift over the walls, the bookshelves, the desk itself. Her attention, unlike Harris's, did not linger on what was missing, but rather on what was out of place. A small smudge on the corner of a polished tabletop caught her eye, nearly invisible but betraying a finger's presence where no hand should have been. A book, not entirely aligned with its neighbours, leaned slightly to the left, a subtle deviation, easily overlooked yet indicative of recent handling. Miss Marple jotted these observations in her notebook, her expression calm but focused, as if each small anomaly formed a pattern only she could discern. Harris watched, puzzled. "You're reading meaning into a few scratches in a leaning book?" he asked. "It could be nothing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or it could be everything. Often, the most inconsequential details are those that reveal the intent behind a deed. People rarely make mistakes that are truly accidental." She paused by the desk, noticing the inkwell. Still clean but positioned slightly off-centre, the pen lying at a subtle angle inconsistent with Lord Pendleton's usual meticulous habit. "Someone was here," she said softly, "but not to steal or destroy. They wanted to send a message, and perhaps to mislead." Her gaze then shifted to Lady Eleanor, who had been standing silently, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple's attention was not intrusive. It was a careful reading of manner, tone, and subtle cues. "You've been uneasy since last night," she observed, "but your unease is particular, focused not only on the absence of Lord Pendleton, but also on the sense that something is being hidden from you." Lady Eleanor blinked, startled by the precision, then nodded. I suppose. There's a feeling, yes, that not everything is as it seems." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Precisely. And it is that feeling which can often point to truths that the eye alone cannot perceive. Let us consider the others." She directed her attention to the servants, noting the way one maid avoided her gaze, the stooped posture of the butler, the sudden, slight stiffness of the housekeeper. Each gesture, no matter how small, carried a weight of concealment, hesitation, or nervousness. To an ordinary observer, these were mere idiosyncrasies. To Miss Marple, they were threads in a tapestry of human behaviour. She returned to the Black Knight, turning it once more in her hand. Chess is a game of foresight, of calculated moves. Whoever left this understands strategy, and perhaps knows that the mere presence of this piece will unsettle those who enter. But there is more. The placement, the choice of piece, and the absence of anything else suggest that the perpetrator expected attention and reaction. The message is incomplete, but deliberate. Harris frowned. "So, you're saying it's like a puzzle?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "A puzzle intended to provoke thought rather than action. But even a deliberate puzzle can leave clues. It is in what the creator could not, or did not, control that we often find the path forward." She paused, her sharp eyes sweeping the study one more time. On the hearthrug, a faint indentation caught her attention, almost imperceptible, as if something heavy had been placed and removed hastily. She crouched to inspect it, noting the direction in which the fibres were disturbed. "Ah," she murmured. "Something was moved from the desk to here, then returned. The sequence is subtle, but it tells us the order of actions." Lady Eleanor leaned closer. "Could it be he moved it himself?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Number. The impression is not consistent with his habitual care. Lord Pendleton was precise. This is a hand that knew caution but also wished to leave a trace, and that, my dear, is where our first insight lies." She stood and approached the window, peering out at the cliffs and the sea beyond. The fog blurred the line between land and water, between reality and imagination, yet her attention was drawn to a slight irregularity in the stonework beneath the window. A loose slab, nearly imperceptible, suggested that movement, entry or exit, was physically possible, though not obvious. "Hiding in plain sight is often the hallmark of clever deception," she murmured. Harris stepped forward, following her gaze. "Are you suggesting he left by that?" Miss Marple shook her head again, deliberately slow. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. The point is that nothing is impossible in Pendleton Hall, not when one understands the habits of the inhabitant and the possibilities afforded by the architecture. The answer may lie in the unexpected." The morning passed. With measured intensity, Harris conducted further inspections of doors, windows, and secretive nooks, while Miss Marple continued to observe behaviour and detail. Each time she returned to the Black Knight, she traced a path from desk to mantel to hearth, as if replaying the night's events in miniature. And always she returned to the small inconsistencies: a misplaced book, a smudge on polished wood, a look in the eyes of a nervous servant. The sum of these fragments began to form a pattern, though incomplete, suggesting intention, artifice, and perhaps a warning. By midday it became evident that Miss Marple's presence had altered the tenor of the investigation. Where Harris had seen chaos and impossibility, she discerned a plan unfolding in shadows, a strategy concealed beneath layers of ordinary observation. And though no one yet understood the full scope of Lord Pendleton's disappearance, the first tendrils of insight had begun to wind through the hallways of Pendleton Hall. Somewhere within those stone walls the truth remained poised to reveal itself, but only to those who could read the subtle language of gesture, placement, and silent communication. And Miss Marple, with her keen eye and patient mind, was already beginning to do so. The afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the lingering fog that clung stubbornly to the cliffs, casting Pendleton Hall in a muted grey light. Miss Marple, seated at the polished oak table in the drawing-room, carefully sipped a cup of tea while listening to the chorus of nervous voices around her. The household had gathered, each member seated as though attending a tribunal rather than a casual conversation. Servants shifted uneasily in their chairs, eyes darting between one another, their fidgeting betraying a mixture of fear and curiosity. Lady Eleanor sat closest to Miss Marple, her fingers entwined, knuckles white. The constable hovered near the doorway, taking notes while trying to maintain an air of professional detachment, though the unease in the room was contagious. Miss Marple began her questioning gently, allowing each witness the illusion of control while she observed the cracks beneath the surface. First, the butler, Mr. Hargrove, a man whose demeanour was as precise and formal as the estate itself, spoke of the previous night's events with deliberate calm. "I checked the doors and windows," he said, voice steady. "Everything was as it should be. I saw no one enter or leave." Yet as he spoke, his gaze flickered to the Black Knight on the mantel, a subtle hesitation that betrayed more than he intended. Miss Marple noted it, making a small tick in her notebook. "And you did not hear anything unusual?" she asked softly, her voice deceptively casual. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing that could indicate irregularity. Of course there were the usual sounds of the house settling, but that is hardly uncommon in a building of this age." He shifted in his seat, just enough for the seam of his sleeve to crease unnaturally. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and patient, lingered on the subtle tension, recognizing the telltale sign of someone who was guarding information. Next, the maid, Clara, spoke in a hushed, trembling voice. I thought I heard footsteps," she admitted, "but when I looked, no one was there, and the window, it was latched. I don't understand." Her eagerness to provide every detail, every fragment of sensation, contrasted sharply with Hargrove's measured restraint. Miss Marple sensed that Clara's over-enthusiasm might be masking uncertainty or guilt. "And where were you during the evening?" she asked. "I was in the kitchen," Clara replied quickly. "I didn't leave." Yet her eyes avoided the drawing-room entirely, lingering instead on the study. Miss Marple's gaze followed hers. "You may have seen something from the hall outside the study," she suggested mildly, watching for the reaction. Clara hesitated, a blush rising to her cheeks, then admitted, "I thought I saw a shadow, but it could have been my imagination." Each new witness introduced a slightly different version of events. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, insisted she had been in the servants' quarters knitting by candlelight, but a subtle tremor in her voice suggested she was overly rehearsed, as if protecting both herself and someone else. A footman claimed to have heard a soft click from the study, though he admitted he could not identify the source. The statements, while individually plausible, were collectively inconsistent. Miss Marple, quietly observing the tension and hesitation in each, recognized the invisible threads connecting truth, exaggeration, and concealment. Lady Eleanor, meanwhile, spoke with cautious precision, providing her own account of discovering the empty study. "I went to check on him after hearing the grandfather clock strike midnight," she said. "The door was locked. I tried the window. It was fastened. And then I saw the chess piece. The Black Knight." Her description was flawless, polished almost to the point of performance. Miss Marple's brow arched slightly. There was no error, no hesitation, no trace of instinctual recollection. While not a contradiction, the perfection itself suggested a careful construction of narrative, one perhaps meant to control perception. As questioning continued, Miss Marple noticed a small but telling inconsistency. The footman, who initially claimed the click came from the study door, later implied it came from the hearth. The maid, Clara, insisted she had been in the kitchen, yet her description of the hallway's shadows suggested proximity to the study that she could not have had. Even Hargrove's assertions of calm authority bore tiny fissures. The trembling of a hand as he adjusted a cuff, the brief glance to the fireplace, almost as if seeking reassurance that nothing had been disturbed there. None of these details were overt, but to a trained eye, they formed a pattern of selective truth and careful omission. Miss Marple allowed the witnesses to continue speaking, listening not only to the content of their words, but to the rhythm, the hesitation, the cadence of confession and denial. It was in these subtleties, the pause before an answer, the over-eagerness to fill silence, the defensive inflection, that the real story began to emerge. People lie differently, she reflected, depending on motive and fear. Some lie to protect themselves, some to shield another, some simply to maintain control over a situation they cannot comprehend. And in Pendleton Hall, where the impossible disappearance had shaken the entire household, each lie was both shield and beacon. Harris, growing increasingly frustrated, interjected at one point, "Miss Marple, surely we cannot trust every whim and hesitation. We need something tangible." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The tangible is only part of the story. The human element, the subtle contradictions and slips, is often far more revealing. We must attend to what is not said, as much as to what is." She returned her gaze to the Black Knight, the piece now seeming almost to pulse with the weight of hidden meaning. "And sometimes the smallest item can cast the longest shadow over the truth." A particularly revealing moment came when the butler, Hargrove, recounted how he had secured the doors that night. "I double-checked every lock," he said firmly. "There was no way in, none, and yet—" His voice faltered, and he clenched his hands together. "And yet I cannot account for his absence." Miss Marple's eyes lingered, noting the combination of pride and fear in his expression. There was more to his story, and she suspected it involved knowledge he was hesitant to share. Then a quiet voice broke through, the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, muttering almost under her breath. "It's as if he wanted to vanish or be taken. Either way, someone knew what to expect." Her eyes darted toward the study, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's ears caught the inflection, a mixture of realization and fear, suggesting that Mrs. Fenwick herself had glimpsed, or at least suspected, more than she admitted openly. By late afternoon, the first tangible threads of deception had begun to emerge. Miss Marple had mapped the inconsistencies, noting over-eagerness, subtle avoidance, and contradictions in sequence and detail. Some witnesses were too precise, some too vague, some deliberately misdirecting, and some afraid to speak at all. The interplay of these variations hinted at motive, perhaps fear of exposure, perhaps protection of another, perhaps the desire to manipulate perception. And yet, the full picture remained elusive. The chess piece, the locked study, the impossibility of entry and exit, all suggested a cunning plan layered atop human fallibility, a complex tapestry woven with both physical and psychological threads. Miss Marple, seated calmly as shadows lengthened across the drawing room, allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "There is deception here," she murmured softly, almost to herself. "And there are truths buried beneath it. Each witness has offered a piece, though some have wrapped theirs in falsehood. The puzzle is becoming clearer, though the final shape is still hidden." Her eyes swept over the assembled household, noticing every twitch of muscle, every nervous glance. Somewhere among them, she knew, lay not only the explanation of the disappearance, but also the mind that had orchestrated it, capable of manipulating objects and people with equal precision. And as dusk fell over Pendleton Hall, turning the cliffs into dark, looming silhouettes against the sky, the game of observation and deduction was underway. Every word spoken, every gesture made, every subtle contradiction noted, would bring Miss Marple closer to the hidden design behind Lord Pendleton's vanishing. She felt it with the quiet certainty of one who had long observed human nature in all its guile and fragility. The truth was there, wrapped in deception, and only patience and keen attention would unravel it. The evening settled over Pendleton Hall like a heavy curtain, the fading light leaving the stone walls cloaked in deep shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, the black night resting on the table before her, its small presence a constant reminder of the enigma she faced. Around her, the household murmured softly, some whispering conjectures, others glancing nervously at one another. It was in this delicate tension, the intersection of fear and expectation, that the true complexity of the case revealed itself. Miss Marple began with the obvious, the known relationships, the tangible connections, the family and staff whose lives intersected at Pendleton Hall. Each person had a story, each story a plausible reason to harbour resentment or desire. Lady Eleanor, elegant and composed, was heir to the estate, yet her inheritance was conditional upon her marital arrangements and family expectations. Her life, though outwardly secure, was bound by obligations that could make even the most gentle of her personality bitter in private moments. Could ambition, a desire for autonomy, have driven her to manipulate circumstances, even indirectly, to remove her uncle from the picture? The thought gave Miss Marple pause. Lady Eleanor had every reason to maintain appearances, to play the dutiful niece, yet the subtle perfection of her accounting, her flawless attention to detail, suggested a mind accustomed to controlling perception. Then there was the butler, Mr. Hargrove, whose meticulous care of the household mirrored Lord Pendleton's own fastidious nature. He had been with the family for decades, a man whose loyalty seemed absolute, yet decades of service could breed a quiet, simmering resentment, a desire for influence, control, or even simple recognition. Hargrove had the access, the knowledge of the house's inner workings, and the discretion to act unnoticed. And though he appeared composed, Miss Marple had seen the fissures, hesitations, subtle glances, micro-expressions that hinted at knowledge withheld. Was loyalty absolute, or a carefully maintained mask over ambition? The servant's motives were subtler, but no less tangled. Clara, the young maid, had been eager to speak, almost desperate to provide details, yet that eagerness betrayed uncertainty. Perhaps she had seen more than she admitted, or perhaps she feared being implicated in events she barely understood. Fear alone, especially in a house of such discipline and expectation, could twist perception into action. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, seemed to occupy a delicate balance between duty and awareness. Her hushed mutterings, the tiny tremors of her voice when describing the night's events, suggested a mind weighed down by secrets. Perhaps knowledge of an impending action, perhaps memories she wished to protect. And the footman, subtle in observation yet inconsistent in recounting events, added another layer, the promise of minor details that contradicted prior statements, each contradiction forming a link in a chain of motives that defied simple explanation. Miss Marple drew a rough diagram in her notebook, connecting individuals to their possible motives, noting alibis and relationships and marking inconsistencies. Greed, she realized, was a thread that could not be dismissed. Lord Pendleton's estate was considerable, and the inheritance tied to family loyalty, Marriage and service created an environment in which material desire could quietly fester. Revenge was subtler. Old grievances, long-forgotten slights, tiny irritations magnified over years of close quarters. Jealousy, the quiet poison of the heart, emerged not only among family members but among staff who had observed affections, favoritism, or privileges bestowed and withheld. And fear of exposure, fear of change, fear of the unknown, underlay every action and hesitation. Each thread alone could motivate, but in combination they formed a tangled web that made the vanishing all the more complex. Miss Marple then turned to alibis, testing their solidity against both observation and intuition. Lady Eleanor's account, though impeccably delivered, relied entirely on her knowledge of the household schedule and her own observations, leaving gaps that could be exploited by one with both knowledge and opportunity. Hargrove's movements were precise and constrained, yet the micro-movements she had observed, the fleeting glance to the fireplace, the momentary hesitation, suggested a mental calculation, the weighing of truth against concealment. The footman's shifting stories introduced temporal inconsistencies, small but meaningful in their accumulation. And Clara, who initially appeared naive, revealed her uncertainty in the telling of minor details, the direction of a shadow, the sequence of a sound, the presence of something fleeting and unseen. Each of these small uncertainties added to the mosaic of motive, creating an intricate lattice of potential culpability. Miss Marple paused to reflect on the implications. The crime itself, the disappearance of Lord Pendleton from a locked study, was physically extraordinary, yet the human element suggested a far more conventional route. The plan, however audacious, required someone who knew both the habits of the household and the vulnerabilities of its occupants. Someone who understood psychology as keenly as architecture, who could manipulate perception with the faintest suggestion, and who could mask intent under the guise of ordinary behavior. The locked door, the chess piece, the perfect alignment of objects, all were part of a staged environment designed to confuse and misdirect. The underlying motives, therefore, might be far more revealing than the mechanics of the disappearance itself. The household's interactions, observed through this lens, became a study in layered deception. Lady Eleanor's poised inquiries, though polite and considerate, subtly guided conversation, her phrasing leading toward predetermined conclusions. Hargrove's attentiveness, his careful corrections and gentle reminders of routine, indicated not just diligence but a subtle assertion of control over narrative and perception. The servants, by contrast, offered glimpses of instinctive truth, filtered through fear and loyalty. Miss Marple understood that each behavior, whether careful, rehearsed, or impulsive, was a signal, an echo of motive refracted through individual psychology. She leaned back in her chair, considering the mosaic she had begun to assemble. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear. Each motive alone might drive an action, but here they were intertwined, layered, and mediated through relationships of long familiarity and mutual dependence. The physical impossibility of the vanishing created a backdrop against which these human motives became more pronounced. One did not need supernatural cunning to understand why someone might wish Lord Pendleton gone. What mattered was the convergence of opportunity, knowledge, and desire. As the evening deepened, a storm rolled in over the cliffs, wind and rain rattling the windows and sending tremors through the ancient stone. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection, gazing at the black night. It was more than a symbol. It was a key to understanding the psychology behind the act. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance had anticipated observation and investigation, leaving behind a controlled anomaly to test perception. And behind that anomaly lay the intricate, tangled maze of motive, a labyrinth of human emotion, ambition, and fear. By nightfall, Miss Marple had begun to assign degrees of plausibility to each potential actor, weighing alibi against opportunity, temperament against motive. No single theory explained everything. No single suspect could account for the combination of audacity and subtlety, for the physical trickery and the psychological manipulation. Yet in the intersections, where greed met fear, where loyalty mingled with resentment, she sensed the outline of a pattern emerging. Each person had a stake, a thread in a tapestry that was at once ordinary and extraordinary. The challenge was to trace those threads carefully, to follow the web of human intention through the intricate maze of deception until the path to truth revealed itself. Miss Marple rose and moved quietly to the window, watching the storm lash against the cliffs. The sound of rain on stone, the distant cry of the sea seemed to underscore the complexity she faced. "Motive is rarely simple," she murmured. "It is never singular. And yet, if we observe closely, the contradictions, the hesitations, and the concealed truths will guide us." She knew the next steps would involve probing deeper into character, testing assumptions, and observing responses under pressure. The human heart, after all, left traces far more revealing than fingerprints or footprints ever could. And as Pendleton Hall settled into darkness, the game within its walls shifted from observation to analysis. Miss Marple, with her patient mind and keen insight, felt the faintest stirrings of clarity. The maze of motive was tangled, the threads overlapping, but every thread, every contradiction, every hidden desire brought her closer to understanding not just who might have taken Lord Pendleton, but why, and ultimately how. The next morning a crisp wind blew through Pendleton Hall, carrying with it the briny tang of the sea and the faint rustle of autumn leaves against the stone walls. Constable Harris had arrived at first light, unusually animated, his ledger filled with the careful notes of the previous day's interrogations. "Miss Marple," he began, practically vibrating with excitement, "I believe we have found something concrete." Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with the Black Knight once again positioned at her side, regarded him with calm curiosity. "And what might that be, Constable?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady, carrying the authority of quiet experience. Harris held up a small, folded note he had discovered tucked behind a loose panel in the study's desk. The handwriting, spidery and precise, appeared to be Lord Pendleton's own. It spoke cryptically of a midnight appointment and a favour owed, referencing someone in the household without naming names. For the constable, it was a revelation, a concrete physical clue that seemed to promise resolution. "Look here," he said, spreading the paper on the table. "It's a message that ties the disappearance directly to a single person. I believe we've finally solved it." The household was summoned, and the note was read aloud. Gasps and murmurs echoed through the drawing-room. Miss Marple listened, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her notebook, eyes narrowing not in surprise but in contemplation. The constable, interpreting the reaction as confirmation of his triumph, began making arrangements to confront the presumed culprit. His certainty was infectious, and even Lady Eleanor's shoulders relaxed, as though a heavy burden of uncertainty had been lifted. Yet Miss Marple's mind, as always, moved differently. She examined the note with careful attention, noting the style, the phrasing, and the deliberate ambiguity. The message pointed to a connection, but was neither direct nor unequivocal. Its vagueness, she realized, was a double-edged sword. It could implicate, yes, but it could also mislead. The handwriting matched Lord Pendleton's, but the phrasing suggested something he would not ordinarily have written. It carried the faintest trace of playful obfuscation, the kind of subtle trick one might leave to test perception rather than to provide clarity. The constable, emboldened, began a line of questioning aimed at the maid, Clara, whose earlier eagerness and nervous glances now appeared to align with the note. Clara protested, her voice high and panicked, insisting she had no involvement, yet her earlier contradictions, when pieced together, seemed to match the scenario the note suggested. Harris, eager for closure, was convinced. "She must have known more than she's admitting," he said, eyes alight with triumph. "The evidence is right here." Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her mind tracing invisible paths through the household and the events of the night. She noticed the subtle relief in some servants' faces, the tension in others, and the way Clara's gaze occasionally flickered toward Hargrove. The puzzle had pieces, certainly, but Miss Marple felt an unspoken warning in the atmosphere, a sense that what appeared to be resolution was merely a veneer. The confrontation with Clara was staged in the drawing-room. Harris, bolstered by his apparent breakthrough, pressed her with increasing intensity. "The note points to you, Miss Clara. You were near the study, you heard sounds, you had opportunity. Admit it." Clara's voice trembled as she shook her head vehemently. "I swear I did nothing. I only. She faltered, searching for words, but her protestations, though desperate, rang true to Miss Marple's ears. There was fear, yes, but not the calculated fear of guilt. There was no malice in her expression, no gleam of secret triumph. Miss Marple stepped forward quietly. "Constable, I believe it is prudent to pause before declaring victory." Her words, calm yet firm, drew the room's attention. Harris bristled. "But the evidence is clear. The note, her proximity, the inconsistencies, it all fits." "Fits a story, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the assembled faces. "But a story is not always truth. People's motives, their actions, the subtle interplay of fear and deception can make guilt appear where there is none. It is rarely as straightforward as it seems." She lifted the note and examined it again. "Consider the phrasing, the context. It is deliberate, yes, but it is also incomplete. Someone has orchestrated a narrative, and not for clarity, for misdirection." Harris's frustration was palpable, yet even he could not ignore the subtle tension she had highlighted. Miss Marple turned her attention to the household, noting small, telling reactions, the barely perceptible shift of the footman, the fleeting glance from Mrs. Fenwick, the composed but carefully measured breathing of Hargrove. Each movement, each hesitation, suggested awareness, calculation, or concealment. Someone among them had understood exactly how the note would be perceived, and had used it to create a false conclusion. The afternoon stretched on with Miss Marple quietly observing, letting the apparent resolution unfold before her discerning eye. Clara, exhausted and frightened, remained seated, while the constable continued to press her. The atmosphere thickened with the tension of expectation and the false comfort of apparent progress. Miss Marple, however, felt the weight of something unsaid, a lurking presence behind the neat facades of the household. She sensed that the real actor, the one who had orchestrated the disappearance and the misleading clues, remained in the shadows, watching and waiting. A subtle incident finally drew Miss Marple's attention. The black knight, which she had placed back on the mantel for observation, caught a flicker of candlelight reflecting off its polished surface. At that precise moment, Hargrove's hand twitched ever so slightly toward it, an almost imperceptible gesture that betrayed not desire but recognition, a recognition of intent, a silent acknowledgement of a plan understood. Miss Marple noted it, a faint smile touching her lips. The clue was small, almost invisible, yet it carried enormous weight. The false breakthrough was exactly what the real culprit had intended, a diversion to shift suspicion onto someone innocent, while the true architect remained free to observe and manipulate. Lady Eleanor, still concerned for the household's peace, asked hesitantly, "Do you think we were hasty, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently, her eyes never leaving the Black Knight. "Sometimes resolution is most dangerous when it is too swift. A mind capable of orchestrating disappearance, misdirection, and deception is rarely satisfied with a simple puzzle. The real danger lies in assuming that what appears to be solved has indeed been solved." Even as the household absorbed her words, the storm outside intensified, wind lashing against the cliffs, sending tremors through the walls. It was as if Pendleton Hall itself shivered, aware that the calm was deceptive, that the pause in tension was merely the quiet before another, more revealing movement. Miss Marple sensed it keenly. The true perpetrator was patient, watching from within the walls of familiarity, waiting for the right moment to act again, confident in the misdirection they had carefully crafted. By evening, the supposed breakthrough had settled over the household, with Harris reluctantly agreeing to a temporary pause in his accusations. Clara, though frightened, was left in relative peace, her innocence quietly acknowledged. Yet the sense of unease lingered like a shadow at the edges of the drawing-room. Miss Marple, seated calmly with her notebook open, understood that the night ahead would not bring clarity, only the continuing dance of observation, deduction, and the quiet, unseen manoeuvres of a mind both clever and patient. The case, for all appearances, had reached a milestone, but it was a false victory. Somewhere, hidden behind carefully controlled gestures, subtle lies, and the smallest of acknowledgments, the real criminal remained, observing the chaos they had sown. Miss Marple's sharp mind, attuned to the delicate signals of human behavior, had already begun to track the invisible thread that led from misdirection to truth, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that when the next move was made, it would be precise, calculated, and devastatingly revealing. The storm that had battered Pendleton Hall the previous night left behind a raw, damp morning. Rain-slicked paths led from the cliffs to the main entrance, and the estate itself seemed to sigh under the weight of lingering fog. Miss Marple walked quietly through the halls, her mind turning over the events of the past days. The apparent breakthrough, the false victory, the intricate web of motives, all these threads were woven tightly, yet one strand remained elusive. She had the sense that the key to the disappearance and the misdirection surrounding it lay not in what was immediately visible, but in what had been long forgotten. Her attention returned to the study where the Black Knight rested silently on the mantel, a sentinel for secrets yet untold. As she examined the room, her eyes fell upon a small stack of papers that had been overlooked in the initial frenzy, correspondence between Lord Pendleton and a former legal associate, yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded. Most of the household had assumed them irrelevant, old financial matters, resolved and archived. But Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. She carefully unfolded one letter, scanning the contents. It referred to a dispute over land, a minor inheritance, and a disagreement involving a distant cousin and a man long since dismissed from service at Pendleton Hall. The details seemed mundane at first, but she noted the subtle hints of tension, the careful wording that hinted at resentment carried over years. Suddenly, a detail caught her eye. A date. The correspondence was nearly 30 years old, yet the events described bore a striking resemblance to the tensions currently surfacing in the household. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. Long-buried grievances had a way of resurfacing, often through unexpected channels, and it was possible that the disappearance of Lord Pendleton was the culmination of an old, unresolved dispute. The connections, she realized, were not only temporal but personal. People who had interacted decades ago, whose lives had diverged, yet remained linked through family, loyalty and obligation, now converged again in a delicate and dangerous alignment. Her thoughts turned to the staff. Hargrove had served the family for decades, a presence as constant as the stone walls themselves. Yet he, too, had his own history intertwined with these old correspondences. Miss Marple recalled a fleeting mention during questioning of a man who had been dismissed from service long ago under vague circumstances, yet Hargrove had shown an unusual reaction when the name arose. It was subtle, a brief tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes, but enough for someone attuned to human behavior to notice. Could the man's past, and Hargrove's connection to it, be a thread in this tapestry? Clara and Mrs. Fenwick, too, seemed to have links that went deeper than their current positions suggested. Mrs. Fenwick, in particular, had hinted at knowledge of events from decades past, muttering under her breath about favours owed and promises made. These were small clues, almost discarded as inconsequential, yet Miss Marple had learned to trust the echoes of the past. The seemingly disconnected memories, forgotten disputes, and quiet loyalties often held the key to understanding the present. With the letters in hand, Miss Marple began to reconstruct a hidden network. She noted the distant cousin mentioned repeatedly in the correspondence, now long absent from Pendleton Hall, yet whose presence had lingered through the subtle distribution of wealth, property, and influence. She also noted the overlap of previous employees and family friends, people whose allegiances were shaped not just by obligation, but by the lingering effects of unresolved conflicts. In this web, everyone's role was interconnected. Hargrove's loyalty, Lady Eleanor's inheritance, the maid's attentiveness, Mrs. Fenwick's discretion, they were all strands in a network spun decades ago. It was the convergence of these old grievances with present-day motives that illuminated a pattern previously overlooked. The disappearance was not merely an act of mischief or ambition, it was the culmination of long-standing resentments and subtle manipulations, a carefully orchestrated continuation of a narrative begun in a past that most had thought irrelevant. Miss Marple realized that to unravel the current mystery, she had to understand these histories, the hidden debts, the promises, and the grudges that had been silently maintained. Her mind drifted back to the Black Knight. The choice of a chess piece as a clue, she reflected, might itself have been symbolic, a nod to strategic games played long ago, games in which foresight, patience and subtlety determined victory. The orchestrator of the disappearance had a mind attuned to both human behaviour and the deliberate use of symbols. Miss Marple saw the pattern forming. Each small act in the present was mirrored by echoes from the past, a subtle reminder that no action occurs in isolation. The breakthrough came in a quiet conversation with Mrs. Fenwick, who had been polishing silver in the dining hall. Miss Marple approached her gently, allowing the older woman the comfort of privacy. "Mrs. Fenwick," she began softly, "do you recall a certain disagreement that occurred many years ago between Lord Pendleton and someone who was once close to the household?" Fenwick's hands trembled slightly, her eyes widening as she regarded the detective. I had thought that long forgotten," she whispered. "But yes, there were tensions, promises unfulfilled, small betrayals, debts that were never repaid." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And do you believe any of those old tensions could influence actions today?" A long pause followed. "Perhaps," Mrs. Fenwick admitted. "Perhaps more than one might expect. People carry grudges, even silently, and sometimes the consequences surface when least anticipated." Her gaze fell to the floor, and Miss Marple could sense a story half told, memories carefully curated, yet revealing themselves under quiet pressure. The past, it seemed, had not been idle. It had been waiting, quietly, for the opportunity to influence the present. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had pieced together a clearer picture. Hargrove's subtle reactions, the overlapping histories, the long-forgotten disputes, all pointed to the fact that the disappearance was not a simple matter of immediate motive. It was layered, drawing strength from decades-old grievances, loyalties, and rivalries. The orchestrator of the disappearance had skillfully combined knowledge of the past with manipulation of the present, ensuring that every action, every clue, and every misdirection aligned with a narrative that only someone familiar with the history of Pendleton Hall could truly understand. Miss Marple considered the household as a whole. Lady Eleanor's poised presence, the servants' nervous attentions, the butler's controlled vigilance, all were shaped not only by the events of recent nights, but by subtle, enduring influences of the past. The threads connecting them were invisible to most observers, yet with careful scrutiny, a network of relationships emerged. Alliances, debts, favours and resentments that had persisted quietly, influencing decisions and perceptions without attracting attention. The disappearance was the point at which these threads converged, a deliberate orchestration, exploiting human nature and memory alike. As dusk fell, the light in the study softened, casting long shadows across the walls and the Black Knight, which seemed to stand guard over centuries of hidden tension. Miss Marple, notebook in hand, reviewed her observations. The past, she reflected, was not merely a backdrop. It was an active force shaping the present, providing both motive and means. The crime, she now realized with clarity, was as much about history as it was about the immediate circumstances. Whoever had planned the disappearance had studied the lives, relationships, and lingering conflicts of the household meticulously, exploiting both the weight of memory and the opacity of human perception. And as Pendleton Hall settled into quiet twilight, Miss Marple understood the path ahead. To resolve the mystery, she would need to unravel not only the present clues and contradictions, but also the invisible threads stretching back decades. The shadows of the past were long, and they reached into every corner of the hall, touching every individual, shaping every hesitation, and guiding every secret. Only by tracing these threads with patience, precision, and careful observation could she hope to illuminate the truth behind Lord Pendleton's disappearance, revealing the full story hidden beneath the layers of history and human complexity. The evening air in Pendleton Hall had grown still, carrying only the faintest scent of rain-soaked stone and the lingering chill of the cliffs. Miss Marple, seated near the study fireplace, studied the household with a patient intensity that had become almost second nature. The storm had passed, leaving the estate in a quiet, contemplative haze, but the tension within the walls remained taut, like a string drawn too tightly. The false breakthrough had settled uneasily over the household, and Miss Marple knew it would take something unusual to unsettle the carefully maintained facades. Her plan, she decided, would not rely on conventional questioning or the pressure of repeated interrogations. Instead, she would employ a subtle psychological tactic, a test of perception and character, designed to elicit instinctive responses. Often, she reflected, it is the spontaneous, unguarded reaction that reveals more than hours of careful testimony. The trick would be to present a scenario that would expose the carefully concealed motivations of the true culprit, while leaving the innocent unshaken. She began with Hargrove, whose composed demeanour and meticulous attention to detail had long suggested both loyalty and restraint. "Mr. Hargrove," she said softly, producing from her bag a small, seemingly innocuous item, an old, ornate key she had found earlier tucked behind a panel in the study. Its origin was uncertain, yet it bore the subtle markings of long use. "Do you recognize this?" Hargrove's eyes flickered, but only for a moment. His lips pressed into a thin line, and a faint pallor brushed his cheeks. Miss Marple watched carefully, noting the micro-expression, too brief for anyone else to notice, yet revealing a flash of recognition and, perhaps, concern. I cannot say," he replied, voice steady but measured, as though choosing words with extreme caution. Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger, observing the subtle shifts in posture and gaze. "It seems familiar to you," she said lightly. "But familiarity is not guilt, is it? We are all, after all, shaped by objects and memories from the past." Her phrasing was deliberate, designed to encourage reflection without confrontation. Hargrove shifted slightly, a barely perceptible tightening in the jaw, the faintest contraction of fingers on the armrest. He was guarding something, and the key had touched a nerve. Next, she introduced a scenario involving the household's most curious item, the Black Knight chess piece, already central to her deductions. Placing it before the assembled household, she spoke almost conversationally. "It is fascinating how objects can carry meaning beyond their appearance. Consider this piece, for example. To some, it is merely a game token. To others, it is a reminder of strategy, patience, and foresight." She allowed her eyes to sweep across the room, noting the reactions. Lady Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her chair. Clara's gaze, wide and anxious, dropped to the floor. Mrs. Fenwick's lips pressed thin, her eyes flicking briefly toward Hargrove. The subtle psychological pressure was beginning to take effect. Miss Marple did not need confessions or dramatic revelations. She needed glimpses of instinctual reaction, the kind of fleeting cracks in composure that spoke louder than words. She continued, allowing the room to settle, the storm of internal tension unfolding as the suspects reacted to her indirect probing. It was Clara who responded first, though not in the way the household expected. Miss Marple's casual reference to strategy seemed to touch something in her memory. I remember playing chess with him," Clara said hesitantly, voice trembling. He taught me moves, always insisted that every action had consequences." Her hands shook slightly. Miss Marple noted the innocence in her recollection. It was unguarded, unscripted, and true. Clara's response contained no malice, only memory, a stark contrast to the careful calculations elsewhere in the room. Hargrove, by contrast, reacted differently. His eyes darkened for a moment, and he leaned slightly forward, a shadow passing across his otherwise controlled face. "The game is only as fair as the player," he muttered, almost under his breath. The comment, seemingly innocuous, carried an edge, a subtle assertion of understanding, control, and perhaps a veiled acknowledgement of intent. Miss Marple recognized the significance immediately. The phrasing mirrored the manipulation she had observed. In the disappearance itself, someone had orchestrated events with precision, exploiting both psychology and circumstance. She decided it was time to introduce a second layer of her tactic. Moving to the hearth, she retrieved a small, seemingly unrelated object, a delicate, gilded envelope she had discovered tucked beneath the carpet earlier. "This," she said, holding it lightly, "was found hidden near the study." Nothing of immediate importance, one might think, yet even the smallest detail can tell a story if we know how to read it. She turned to the assembled household, her voice carrying a quiet, probing curiosity. Who, I wonder, had the awareness to place it there, and for what purpose? The effect was immediate. Lady Eleanor's composed facade remained intact, yet a faint tightening around her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. Clara recoiled slightly, instinctively shifting her weight, while Mrs. Fenwick's fingers clenched around the edge of her apron. Hargrove, however, showed the most subtle but telling response. His hand twitched toward the envelope, then stopped as though in conflict, an almost imperceptible hesitation that revealed internal calculation. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She had found the crack she was looking for. To reinforce her observation, she allowed the moment to stretch, observing the household as tension hung in the room. It was the silence between words, the micro-movements of hands and eyes, the fleeting adjustments of posture that revealed truth more effectively than direct accusation. And in that silence, Hargrove's composure, carefully maintained over decades of service, showed the tiniest fracture, a sign that he alone understood both the significance of the objects and the orchestration behind them. Miss Marple continued her subtle probing, speaking softly about the nature of strategy and foresight, about human behaviour and the consequences of concealed intent. She framed her words as gentle observation, inviting reflection rather than confrontation. And each time she did, Hargrove responded with micro-expressions, a slight tightening of fingers, a shadow crossing his eyes, a faint shift in stance that collectively told a story of awareness, planning, and silent manipulation. The other members of the household, while affected, exhibited responses rooted in fear, confusion, or innocence, none carrying the same weight of deliberate calculation. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple had gathered enough. She observed quietly as Hargrove retired to his quarters, his movements measured, yet revealing a mind occupied with careful calculation. The test had worked. The psychological tactic had drawn forth a subtle, instinctive reaction, a signal too fleeting for the untrained eye, but unmistakable to one attuned to the nuances of human behaviour. The envelope, the chess piece, the ornate key, all had been instruments, gently applied, to elicit recognition without accusation, exposing a hidden layer of deception. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, notebook open, her expression thoughtful yet serene. She reflected on the effectiveness of her unconventional approach. By creating scenarios that engaged instinct, memory, and perception, she had observed the crack in the otherwise impenetrable facade, a momentary lapse that revealed more than any interrogation could. The true orchestrator of the disappearance had shown, albeit fleetingly, their awareness and intent, leaving Miss Marple with the confirmation she needed to focus her next steps. The household, unaware of the precise insight gained, retired to their rooms under the shadow of unresolved tension, leaving Miss Marple alone with her observations. The storm had passed, but the undercurrents of human behaviour, subtle and unrelenting, persisted. She understood that the unusual tactic had not solved the case outright, but it had revealed a pathway, an opening through which truth might finally be observed. As the candlelight flickered across the drawing-room, the black night resting beside her seemed almost to nod in quiet approval. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The deceptive calm of the evening had been tested, and a hidden reaction had emerged, small yet telling. From it she could trace the faintest outline of intention, the subtle signature of the mind that had orchestrated Lord Pendleton's disappearance. Patience, observation, and the careful application of an unconventional method had done what brute questioning could not. It had exposed the first glimpse of truth in a carefully constructed labyrinth of deception. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows of Pendleton Hall, casting long, narrow beams of light across the study floor. Miss Marple had spent the night reviewing her notes, retracing every observation, every subtle reaction, and every layered motive she had uncovered over the past days. The household, outwardly calm, remained charged with tension, each person quietly aware that the investigation had shifted from conjecture to quiet scrutiny. There was a rhythm to the day now, a fragile order, and Miss Marple sensed that it could be shattered at any moment. Her eyes rested on the black knight chess piece, which she had repositioned on the mantel, a silent sentinel over the unfolding mystery. In the quiet of the morning, she revisited the ornate key and the gilded envelope, both instruments of her previous psychological test. Each item had provided clues, subtle yet unmistakable, guiding her closer to the orchestrator of Lord Pendleton's disappearance. She intended to follow the trail meticulously, piece by piece, until the hidden structure of the crime revealed itself fully. Yet the fragile equilibrium of Pendleton Hall was not to last. As the household busied itself with routine tasks, a sudden commotion erupted from the study. Miss Marple moved quickly, her calm demeanour belying the tension in her chest. She entered the room to find Constable Harris in visible distress, the ledger clutched in his hands, his face pale. "Miss Marple!" he exclaimed, almost tripping over the rug in his haste. "It's gone. The envelope, the key, both. They've vanished." Miss Marple's heart tightened, though her expression remained composed. "Vanished?" she asked, her voice measured. "Do you mean stolen, misplaced, or deliberately removed?" I don't know," Harris stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I left them here, as we discussed, to review their significance. When I returned, they were gone. Nothing else disturbed, nothing broken. Just gone." His words were hurried, the panic in his tone unmasked. Miss Marple's gaze swept the study, noting the absence of disruption. The carefully arranged room, previously a repository of subtle clues, now seemed sterile, stripped of its revealing objects. "Someone is working against us," she murmured, more to herself than to the constable. "They have removed the very evidence that could guide us to the truth. This is deliberate, and it is precise." The implications were immediate. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance understood both the value of evidence and the investigative mind of the detective. The theft was no act of desperation. It was a calculated move to bury the trail, to delay discovery, and to exert psychological pressure. Miss Marple felt the familiar surge of resolve that had guided her through countless puzzles. The obstruction itself was a clue, revealing not only the skill of the perpetrator, but also their awareness of what she had already discerned. She began methodically questioning the household. Lady Eleanor appeared shocked and concerned, yet her demeanour remained polished. "I can assure you, Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with this," she said, her voice calm but edged with defensiveness. Clara, seated nearby, shook her head vigorously, muttering that she hadn't touched anything. Mrs. Fenwick's lips pressed thin, her eyes momentarily flicking toward Hargrove before she lowered them, avoiding the detective's gaze. Even Harris, flustered and anxious, could only confirm that no one had been seen near the study in the brief interval between his leaving and returning. Miss Marple observed each reaction carefully. The removal of the evidence had been executed with precision, which narrowed the field of possible actors. It required access, knowledge of the study's contents, and awareness of the investigative significance of the objects. Not all household members possessed that combination, yet she could not dismiss the possibility of collaboration or careful orchestration. The subtle tension between loyalty, fear, and ambition made trust a delicate commodity. Anyone could be concealing intent, anyone could be masking action under the guise of routine. Returning to the room, Miss Marple scrutinized the surfaces, the corners, the smallest crevices for overlooked traces. A faint scuff mark near the fireplace, a subtle disturbance in the dust on the mantel, suggested a hurried but careful extraction. The movement had been deliberate yet careful, avoiding obvious disruption. This was not the act of someone careless or panicked. It was the work of a person who understood both the environment and the mind watching it. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the Black Knight, now serving as both a marker and a silent witness. Whoever had removed the evidence had left just enough behind to maintain the appearance of order while executing a precise act of concealment. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the individuals she had observed during her psychological test. Hargrove, whose composure had cracked subtly, who had shown an almost imperceptible recognition of significance in the objects, seemed the most capable of such precision. But she did not rush to judgment. The removal itself could have been executed by someone anticipating Hargrove's reactions, someone capable of calculating the chain of perception and expectation. The manipulation extended beyond simple action. It encompassed influence, misdirection, and careful orchestration of observation. she decided to employ her usual combination of patience and subtlety. Instead of immediately accusing or interrogating, she arranged for the household to remain under quiet observation, allowing herself to trace reactions and behaviours for further clues. Every hesitation, every flicker of attention, every shift in posture could now be interpreted in the context of both the missing evidence and the prior psychological probing. Miss Marple understood that the act of removing the key and envelope was not merely obstruction, it was a message, a challenge, and a reveal of character all at once. By late afternoon, subtle discrepancies began to emerge. A servant was seen glancing repeatedly toward the study when no attention should have been necessary. Mrs. Fenwick, in arranging tea, exhibited a small, fleeting movement of fingers toward her pocket, though she appeared otherwise composed. Hargrove, returning from his rounds, adjusted his watch with slightly exaggerated care, a movement that seemed more performative than necessary. Each observation added weight to Miss Marple's mounting suspicion. Someone was attempting to manipulate not only the physical environment, but also the perceptions of those observing it. Miss Marple considered the broader implications. The stolen evidence, if returned, would clarify significant aspects of the disappearance, yet its absence forced her to rely on deduction, human behaviour, and careful reasoning, rather than physical confirmation. The case had advanced into a stage in which psychological manoeuvring was as crucial as the tangible clues themselves. The orchestrator had shifted the stakes, transforming the investigation from a straightforward search for items into a contest of perception, patience, and subtle influence. As dusk fell and the household gathered for the evening meal, Miss Marple sat quietly, notebook open, eyes moving across the assembled faces. The removal of evidence had heightened tension, but it had also revealed something essential. The true perpetrator was confident, cunning, and aware of her methods. By observing reactions, noting hesitations, and tracking micro-expressions, she could now see patterns emerge that had previously been hidden. Trust within the household had become fragile, but that fragility itself illuminated character, revealing those capable of deception and those whose reactions were shaped by fear, loyalty, or innocence. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the Black Knight, standing sentinel on the mantel above. Its presence, once a simple instrument of observation, now seemed emblematic of the challenge she faced. A reminder that in a world of concealed motives and deliberate misdirection, the smallest signals, an unnoticed movement, a fleeting glance, a subtle gesture, could reveal far more than overt evidence ever could. She understood that the missing key and envelope were not simply obstacles. They were part of the larger narrative, designed to test her insight, to provoke observation, and to expose the character of the individual manipulating events from the shadows. By nightfall, the household retired, each person carrying with them the tension and unease that the vanished evidence had wrought. Miss Marple remained in the study, her mind carefully reconstructing the possible scenarios. Someone had acted to remove crucial information, yet in doing so, they had revealed more than they realized: precision, access, awareness, and a willingness to manipulate perception, all of which narrowed the field of potential culprits. The theft had not stopped the investigation, it had merely shifted it to a higher plane, one in which insight, observation, and psychological acumen would determine progress. And as the halls of Pendleton Hall settled into quiet darkness, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, tracing invisible lines from past motives, present actions, and human behavior. The vanishing of evidence had elevated the stakes, but it had also provided clarity in the subtle cracks, gestures, and reactions of those within the household. In the shadows of this quiet evening, she knew the path to the truth remained, and that each observation would bring her closer to revealing the orchestrator of Lord Pendleton's disappearance, no matter how carefully concealed their machinations. The night air hung heavy over Pendleton Hall, dense with the scent of wet stone and lingering storm. Miss Marple had retired early, believing the day's events, a stolen envelope and a vanished key, had elevated the investigation into a more subtle psychological realm. The household was quiet, subdued under the tension of invisible scrutiny. Candles flickered in the drawing room, shadows dancing along the walls, lending an almost tangible presence to the sense of anticipation that had settled over the estate. Miss Marple was seated near the hearth, reviewing her meticulously compiled notes. Each observation, each reaction, each subtle hesitation in behaviour was catalogued, measured, and weighed. The vanishing of the key and envelope had been more than a simple act of obstruction. It had been a message, a challenge, and a test. Someone in the household was watching her as closely as she had been watching them. Someone, she realized, was several moves ahead, anticipating her thoughts, predicting her tactics. A sudden scream shattered the quiet, cutting through the halls with the jagged urgency of panic. Miss Marple sprang from her chair, heart quickening but mind clear. The sound had come from the servants' quarters, a place usually calm at this hour. Candles clattered as she moved swiftly through the corridors, each step echoing against the stone walls. The household had already stirred. Lady Eleanor and Mrs. Fenwick appeared at the top of the stairs, their expressions pale with alarm, while Clara ran ahead, trembling. They found the source of the disturbance in the east wing near the old library. Hargrove, the normally composed butler, lay sprawled across the floor unconscious, a dark stain spreading across the front of his waistcoat. A heavy bookcase had been shifted slightly, the floor beneath it marked by a faint scuff as though something, or someone, had been forcibly moved. The sight was jarring. The calculated calm of the house had been shattered. Miss Marple knelt beside Hargrove, noting the subtle signs of an assault rather than an accident. "He has been attacked," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "Deliberately, carefully." Hargrove groaned, stirring slightly, his eyes opening with confusion. "Miss Marple," he muttered, voice raspy. It was..." But he fell silent, too weak to continue. The implications were immediate and alarming. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance and the removal of evidence had escalated, moving from manipulation to violence. The attack on Hargrove was no mere act of intimidation. It was a precise warning, a calculated effort to destabilize the household and hinder investigation. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting this new event with the previous days. The stolen envelope, the ornate key, the psychological probes, and Hargrove's subtle reactions. All pointed to a perpetrator who was not only several steps ahead, but confident in both foresight and execution. As Hargrove was assisted to the adjacent room and tended to by Mrs. Fenwick and Clara, Miss Marple examined the scene. The bookcase had been moved with care, leaving minimal disturbance yet creating just enough imbalance to injure someone in the vicinity. On the floor lay a small scrap of paper, overlooked in the initial chaos. She picked it up, observing the handwriting. Deliberate, precise, yet faintly mocking. The note contained a single phrase, "Observe carefully, for the next move is yours to prevent." The tone was both threatening and taunting, confirming that the perpetrator was aware of her investigations and, disturbingly, challenging her ability to anticipate further actions. Miss Marple called for the household to gather in the drawing room. The tension was palpable. Lady Eleanor's face was pale, hands tightly clasped together. Clara's eyes darted nervously, and Mrs. Fenwick hovered near the hearth, her posture rigid. Even the normally steadfast servants exhibited subtle signs of fear. The attack had shifted the investigation. No longer was it merely about piecing together a past disappearance or stolen objects. Now it was about preventing further harm. Someone among us is not only aware of our progress, but willing to act to obscure the truth, Miss Marple began, her voice calm yet charged with quiet authority. The attack on Hargrove was deliberate, precise, and intended to intimidate. We must assume the person responsible is prepared to escalate further. It is no longer sufficient to observe, we must anticipate and safeguard. The household listened in stunned silence. Even Lady Eleanor, accustomed to exercising authority within the estate, seemed momentarily subdued by the realization that the danger was immediate and personal. Miss Marple continued, noting the subtle reactions of those around her. "Observe closely," she advised, "not only objects but behavior. The perpetrator has shown a tendency to manipulate, to anticipate, to act when least expected. Trust must be cautious, and attention constant." Miss Marple's eyes swept across the room, noting small tells, a twitch of fingers, the shifting of weight, the flicker of eyes that lingered too long, or too briefly on her. Each reaction, minute though it was, could reveal the hidden hand guiding events. The perpetrator had escalated, but in doing so, had left subtle traces, tiny disruptions in composure, instinctive movements that betrayed control and intent. She decided to employ a strategy combining vigilance with careful psychological observation. Each member of the household would be subtly monitored, their routines noted, and interactions carefully observed. Miss Marple herself would take on a more active role in patrolling the house, moving quietly from room to room, offering presence without accusation, observing responses to her actions. The unseen manipulator had proven capable and bold, but Miss Marple understood that human behaviour, no matter how carefully guarded, was rarely flawless. As night deepened, she patrolled the east wing, revisiting the scene of Hargrove's attack. The shadows lay thick among the bookshelves and the corners of the room, lending an almost living quality to the space. She examined the floor, the slight scuff marks, the alignment of the books, and the positions of furniture. The perpetrator had acted with precision, but even precision left subtle marks, slight dust displacement, faint pressure points on the floor, the shadow of movement. She made careful notes, her mind cataloguing each detail, each potential clue that might reveal the next step in this escalating sequence. By the early hours of the morning, a pattern began to emerge. The attack had not been random. It was targeted, intended to send both a message and a signal. Miss Marple discerned the timing, the method, and the choice of victim. Hargrove had been the one most aware of the household's past connections and had been closest to observing the subtle psychological tactics employed in previous days. By removing him temporarily from the equation, the orchestrator had sought to slow discovery and unsettle the household's sense of security. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where the household had been gathered under her quiet watch. She addressed them with calm authority, explaining the implications of the attack without revealing unnecessary detail that might provoke panic. We must understand that the perpetrator is clever, patient, and bold, but courage and observation can meet such cleverness. Vigilance, awareness, and careful attention to behavior are our tools now. We proceed with care, but we do not retreat. Whoever seeks to manipulate or harm must know that their moves will be anticipated. The household nodded, a fragile resolve forming among them, bolstered by Miss Marple's quiet certainty. Even Lady Eleanor's composure returned, tempered with the humility of recognizing the danger that had entered her home. Clara, though nervous, followed instructions without hesitation, while Mrs. Fenwick's careful movement suggested a readiness to assist rather than hinder. Miss Marple, however, remained focused on the unseen manipulator. The attack had been a calculated step, revealing both the audacity and the mind behind the earlier disappearance. The case was no longer merely about solving a past crime. It was now a test of anticipation, vigilance, and the ability to prevent further tragedy. The orchestrator had revealed themselves indirectly, a shadowy presence guiding events from within, confident in their capacity to remain ahead. As the night deepened and silence settled once more over Pendleton Hall, Miss Marple understood the stakes with crystal clarity. The unexpected twist, the assault on Hargrove, had elevated the urgency of the investigation. The perpetrator was not content with concealment alone. They sought control, influence, and perhaps even the satisfaction of testing her resolve. But Miss Marple, steady and observant, recognized that every bold move contained subtle hints, every escalation left traces of thought, and every action, however audacious, could ultimately be interpreted. The game had intensified, and the detective's task was no longer merely to uncover the past. She must anticipate the next move, protect the innocent, and remain one step ahead of a mind both cunning and patient. The next hours, she knew, would test not only her deductive skill, but her ability to confront danger while preserving the fragile equilibrium of Pendleton Hall. The shadows of the night were long, and the unseen hand of the manipulator had made itself known, but so had Miss Marple's resolve. The morning following Hargrove's attack was tense, the household moving with quiet purpose, each person wary of both the detective and the invisible hand orchestrating events. Pendleton Hall seemed to hold its breath, the echo of last night's violence lingering in the corridors. Miss Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her notebook open, watched the household with a patience that had become almost instinctive. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle deviation from routine now carried the weight of potential significance. For days, she had tracked the movements and reactions of the household, the stolen key and envelope, the psychological tests, the attack on Hargrove, all pieces of a puzzle that appeared chaotic, but which, she suspected, contained a deliberate underlying order. She reviewed her notes once more, cross-referencing observations, small behavioural inconsistencies, and subtle expressions of tension. The orchestrator's actions had been bold and precise, yet Miss Marple trusted her own ability to discern patterns in even the most carefully constructed chaos. Her attention was drawn to a small, almost imperceptible detail she had noted earlier but dismissed in the frenzy of events: a minor slip of language, an offhand comment by Mrs. Fenwick during tea in which she referred to a shadow moving among the books, and laughed nervously, brushing it off as a joke. At the time, Miss Marple had filed it away as inconsequential, a nervous habit of the elderly housekeeper. But now, in the context of the stolen evidence and Hargrove's assault, it acquired significance. The phrasing, shadow moving among the books, mirrored the subtle displacements Miss Marple had observed in the East Wing, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the slight adjustments of the bookcases. She rose and moved to the library, the location of the previous attack. The room was quiet, untouched since the night before, yet the subtle signs remained: the scuff mark near the fireplace, the misalignment of the lower bookcases, and the faint pressure indentations on the floor. Miss Marple ran her fingers gently along the edge of the hearth, noting the dust displacement, the nearly imperceptible trail of movement that suggested careful handling by someone familiar with the room. These tiny anomalies, when viewed collectively, began to form a coherent pattern. Someone had used the space strategically, moving with precision to manipulate perception, inflict harm, and conceal their actions. Her thoughts returned to the seemingly unrelated objects: the ornate key, the gilded envelope, and the black knight chess piece. Each had been used to probe reactions and draw out subtle truths. Alone, they might have seemed arbitrary, but when placed against the backdrop of the library, Hargrove's attack, and Mrs. Fenwick's comment, they suggested a single, orchestrated design. The perpetrator had used both objects and environment as instruments of manipulation, creating a narrative that unfolded in layers, each step building upon the previous, in a subtle choreography of tension and misdirection. Miss Marple considered the behaviour of Hargrove during her psychological tests. His micro-expressions, the fleeting tightening of fingers, the slight contraction of his jaw, all indicated awareness and intent. He had reacted instinctively to the items she had introduced, revealing a mind attuned to detail, a person capable of careful planning and manipulation. Yet his hesitation, his subtle cracks under pressure, suggested that he was not entirely in control of the unfolding events, and that someone else, perhaps a more patient and calculating actor, was guiding the orchestration. It was then that Miss Marple recalled an overlooked observation from the early days of the investigation: Lady Eleanor's precise knowledge of household routines, her almost uncanny awareness of who was in which room at what time. During casual conversation, she had mentioned innocuously that Hargrove never strayed from the East Wing after dark. At the time, the remark seemed trivial, perhaps even flattering his diligence. Yet in light of the attack and the vanished evidence, it now suggested an intimate understanding of movements within the house, a knowledge that could facilitate deliberate placement or removal of objects and strategic manipulation of perception. Miss Marple's mind traced the connections: Lady Eleanor's awareness, Hargrove's subtle responses, Mrs. Fenwick's nervous phrase, the orchestrated theft of key items, and the attack in the library. Each element, seemingly disparate, began to align into a single, comprehensible structure. The perpetrator had relied on precise knowledge of human behavior, exploiting routines, psychological triggers, and the physical environment to maintain control and misdirection. The pattern was subtle, hidden in plain sight, yet now unmistakable. She moved to the study, where the black knight still rested on the mantel. The piece, once merely symbolic, now appeared as a marker, a silent signal guiding both the detective and the orchestrator's own strategy. Miss Marple traced her fingers along the edge of the mantel, noting the faint scratches that suggested the piece had been moved more than once, replaced carefully, each time leaving behind minuscule signs of attention. These details, when cross-referenced with the library incident, The stolen objects and micro-expressions of the household formed the backbone of the hidden pattern. It was not merely Hargrove, Mrs. Fenwick, or Lady Eleanor acting alone. The evidence suggested coordination, either by conscious collaboration or the careful orchestration of a single mind manipulating multiple individuals. The pattern that emerged was one of deliberate, calculated steps. Observe, manipulate, extract, test reactions, and adjust. Each act served a dual purpose, advancing the perpetrator's agenda while revealing subtle truths about human behaviour, trust, and perception. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, notebook in hand, her gaze sweeping across the household assembled under the morning's tentative calm. She noted the micro-movements of each person. Clara's slight fidget, Lady Eleanor's controlled posture, Mrs. Fenwick's wary glances, and Hargrove's measured breathing. Each action, however small, now fit into the larger structure, confirming her emerging theory. The orchestrator had relied on both physical manipulation and psychological insight, leaving behind patterns in both behavior and environment that, once interpreted, revealed the careful choreography of intent. She called the household together, her voice calm but insistent. "It seems that what appeared random or disconnected is not so," she began. "Every small object, every phrase, every movement has been part of a deliberate pattern. The key, the envelope, the black knight, the movements through the library, these were not isolated acts. They were steps in a sequence designed to reveal, mislead, and control perception." The reactions were telling. Lady Eleanor's composed facade faltered just slightly, a flicker of awareness crossing her eyes. Mrs. Fenwick's fingers tightened around her teacup, and Clara shifted in her seat, sensing the weight of implication. Even Hargrove, recovering from the previous night's assault, displayed a subtle tension in posture, a hint of acknowledgement that the detective's insight was nearing its mark. Miss Marple continued, linking each observation together. "The orchestrator of these events has relied upon knowledge, foresight, and subtle influence, and yet, in the smallest details, they have left a trail, a shadow moving among the books, a reaction to a key or an envelope, an instinctive glance or hesitation. These details, unnoticed at first, have now become clear. The pattern has emerged in plain sight, visible to those who know where and how to look." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The realization dawned on the household. The clues had been present all along, embedded in objects, phrases, and behaviors. The chaos was not without order. The seemingly random incidents were the visible manifestation of a single, deliberate mind at work. Miss Marple had seen it unfold, and now the threads could be followed with clarity toward the resolution that had eluded them. With the pattern revealed, the detective's task gained focus. She understood where to look, what to observe, and whose actions warranted closer scrutiny. The puzzle was no longer a collection of isolated incidents. It was a coherent design, a web of manipulation and misdirection whose strands converged upon the orchestrator's identity. The moment of revelation was near, built upon careful observation, attention to detail, and the patient unravelling of the subtleties hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, notebook open, a serene expression on her face. The storm of confusion and violence that had engulfed Pendleton Hall had revealed its underlying structure. The pattern emerged, clear and unyielding, illuminating both motive and method, and pointing the way toward the final confrontation that would resolve the mystery once and for all. The quiet of Pendleton Hall that morning was deceptive, a fragile veneer stretched over days of tension, suspicion, and carefully monitored movements. Miss Marple sat near the drawing-room window, her gaze sweeping the familiar expanse of the cliffs beyond, yet her mind remained firmly anchored to the intricate web of events unfolding inside the estate. The pattern she had discerned in the previous days, a subtle choreography of psychological manipulation, precise actions, and calculated reactions, had guided her closer to the truth. Now, she believed, it was time to confront the deeper currents driving the orchestrator, to understand not only how the crime had been committed, but why. The assembled household appeared unusually subdued that morning. Lady Eleanor maintained her impeccable composure, yet the faint tension in her shoulders and the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed awareness of Miss Marple's scrutiny. Mrs. Fenwick moved carefully about the room, hands clasped in front of her, an almost imperceptible quiver in her fingers. Clara, though calm on the surface, kept her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, as if drawing invisible lines along the patterned rug for reassurance, and Hargrove, still recovering from the assault, sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, eyes darting occasionally toward Miss Marple as though anticipating her deductions. Miss Marple began with a calm observation, speaking as if to herself, but allowing her words to reach the entire room. "We have seen the theft of the envelope and key, the attack in the library, and the intricate manipulations of behaviour that followed. Each act has been precise, calculated, and at times cruel in its subtlety. Yet all of this, impressive as it may be, masks a deeper intention. We must look beyond the surface of control, beyond the pursuit of mere advantage, to understand the true motive." She allowed a pause, letting her words settle like dust in the quiet room. Then, almost casually, she returned to the seemingly insignificant details she had observed. The black knight chess piece on the mantel, the way Hargrove's fingers tightened at certain objects, the subtle phrasing of Mrs. Fenwick's nervous comments, and Lady Eleanor's uncanny knowledge of routines. Objects, phrases, and routines, they are not merely tools of manipulation, she said softly. They are reflections of the mind behind the orchestration, each revealing a desire not just for control, but for something far more personal. The household listened, a faint ripple of unease passing through them. Miss Marple's gaze, steady and unyielding, settled first on Lady Eleanor. "Lady Eleanor," she said, her tone gentle but deliberate, "you have maintained a remarkable appearance of composure throughout these events, and yet your attention to detail, your knowledge of routines, and your subtle orchestration suggest that the motivation here is not financial gain, not petty vengeance, nor even simple ambition." Lady Eleanor's lips pressed tightly, and for the first time a flicker of acknowledgement passed across her eyes. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but Miss Marple's quiet observation held her back. "Instead," Miss Marple continued, "the driving force is far more personal, an intricate blend of obsession, fear of exposure, and a compulsion to control not only events but perception itself. Each step taken, from the removal of evidence to the attack on Hargrove, has been guided by a need to assert dominance over knowledge, over truth, and over those who might challenge your authority within these walls." The room seemed to contract under the weight of her words. Mrs. Fenwick's eyes widened slightly, as if connecting invisible threads she had only glimpsed before. Clara's breathing quickened, a subtle tremor betraying the realization of how deeply the manipulations had penetrated the household. Hargrove's expression, though subdued by recent trauma, displayed a flicker of recognition. He had been a pawn in a far more elaborate game than he had suspected. Miss Marple walked slowly among them, observing reactions with unerring precision. "Consider, if you will, the care with which the key and envelope were removed," she said, gesturing to the empty mantel where the pieces had once rested. It was not merely to hinder investigation. It was to assert control, to test perception, to watch how others reacted, and to create a narrative in which fear, obedience, and instinct were manipulated. The intent was never only concealment, it was psychological mastery. She paused, letting the weight of the realization settle over the room, then returned to Lady Eleanor's composed figure. And yet, behind this desire for control lies something even more profound. The motive is rooted in an old fear of exposure, of shame, of loss of standing within the household and beyond. Every act of manipulation, every subtle intimidation, every carefully orchestrated step has been designed to protect that fear, to prevent revelation of some deeply held secret, and to assert dominance over those who might inadvertently threaten it. The realization struck the household with quiet force. Lady Eleanor's composure faltered entirely, the first cracks appearing in her carefully maintained facade. You think I did all this?" she whispered, voice trembling. "But it was only to protect what is mine, to protect my family's honour." Miss Marple's expression softened, yet her gaze remained firm. "Indeed," she said gently, "the actions you have taken, though extreme and dangerous, stem from a profound psychological need. Money, power, and revenge are but superficial masks. Underneath lies a compulsive desire to shield yourself and assert control over knowledge, perception, and the boundaries of your household. The lengths to which you have gone, the theft of evidence, the manipulation of behaviour, the attack on Hargrove, were extreme measures born of fear and obsession. Clara's eyes filled with tears, realization dawning that the seemingly senseless events had a logic rooted in the mind of a single individual. I didn't understand," she murmured. "I thought it was about the missing items, or perhaps someone angry. But it was something deeper, something personal." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. It is the hidden motive that explains the entire sequence of events. The orchestrator's actions, while outwardly aggressive or controlling, were guided by an inner logic of fear and obsession. They sought to control not only the circumstances, but the perceptions of others, to maintain dominance and prevent exposure of that which they most feared revealing." Hargrove, now seated upright and recovering his strength, spoke quietly, almost to himself. "So, all along, it wasn't just about what we saw, but what we didn't see. The fear, the obsession, that was the driving force behind it all." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "The external manipulations, the removal of evidence, the attacks, the testing of reactions, were reflections of an internal need, a deep psychological compulsion to assert control, protect reputation, and maintain dominance within a carefully constructed hierarchy. Understanding this hidden motive is essential, for it explains both the methods and the madness, and illuminates the path to resolving the mystery fully." Lady Eleanor's head bowed, the weight of recognition pressing heavily upon her. The facade of authority, control, and dignity had been stripped back to reveal vulnerability, obsession, and fear. The crime, once assumed to be driven by greed or revenge, was revealed to be the manifestation of a mind trapped in the compulsion to protect, control, and manipulate, willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain that psychological balance. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate and calm. She regarded the assembled household with a steady gaze. "Now that we understand the underlying motive," she said softly, "we can begin to trace each act, each manipulation, and each misdirection to its source. The hidden logic of fear and obsession provides clarity where before there was only chaos. It explains why the crime unfolded as it did, why the steps were taken in this precise sequence, and why the orchestrator believed they could remain steps ahead. Knowledge of the psychological landscape, more than any tangible evidence, allows us to anticipate and, ultimately, resolve the situation." The room remained quiet, the tension gradually shifting from fear to comprehension. The shocking revelation of the true motive, the interplay of fear, obsession, and the compulsion to control perception, cast a new light on every act committed within Pendleton Hall. The orchestrator's psychology, once obscured by a maze of misdirection and meticulous planning, was now laid bare, exposing not only the reasoning behind the crime, but also the vulnerabilities that could allow it to be resolved. Miss Marple closed her notebook gently, a faint smile touching her lips. The mystery, long tangled in seemingly random acts and subtle manipulations, now revealed its underlying truth. The crime had been driven not by superficial desires, but by a profound, almost obsessive psychological need, a hidden motive that explained the extremes to which the orchestrator had gone. Understanding this, she knew, was the final key to untangling the complex web and restoring order to Pendleton Hall. The evening at Pendleton Hall was heavy with anticipation, the air thickened by candlelight and the quiet hum of tension. Miss Marple had spent the day consolidating her observations, confirming her suspicions, and meticulously arranging the final steps of a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Every stolen envelope, every vanished key, every attack and subtle manipulation had formed a tapestry she now understood in its entirety. Tonight, the truth would be unmasked, and the orchestrator's carefully maintained facade would crumble under the weight of logic, observation, and psychological insight. Miss Marple had prepared the drawing-room as deliberately as a stage set. The household was gathered under the pretence of an ordinary evening, unaware that they were part of a carefully constructed scenario. The Black Knight remained on the mantel, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, while chairs and tables had been subtly repositioned to channel movement and attention. Every detail had been considered: the placement of the light, the angle from which she would observe reactions, the timing of questions and statements. Lady Eleanor entered the room first, her composure impeccable yet fragile under scrutiny. She carried herself with the same grace that had masked her machinations for so long, but Miss Marple noted the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, the fleeting twitch of her fingers, and the tight line of her lips. Mrs. Fenwick and Clara followed, their eyes attentive, their movements careful, reflecting a household on edge without knowing exactly why. Hargrove, seated and recovering from his assault, maintained a quiet vigilance, his own understanding of events sharpening with every passing moment. Miss Marple's calm presence dominated the room. She moved to the centre, hands lightly resting on the back of a chair, her gaze sweeping the assembled figures. "Tonight," she began, her voice quiet yet commanding, "we resolve the question that has hung over Pendleton Hall for weeks. We understand the manipulations, the stolen objects, the attacks, and the misdirections. We know now that the motives were not merely financial or trivial, but deeply personal, rooted in fear, obsession, and the desire to control perception." A subtle murmur passed through the room, eyes flicking to one another, reactions betraying uncertainty, anxiety, and anticipation. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, letting the gravity of her words settle. "And we know," she continued, "that the orchestrator of these events is present here, and that every movement and word, every gesture and hesitation has been part of a carefully designed sequence. The final question is whether the individual will acknowledge this truth or attempt one last desperate manoeuvre." Her gaze settled on Lady Eleanor, unwavering and precise. The countenance that had concealed obsession, manipulation, and meticulous control for so long now faltered. Lady Eleanor's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again, her eyes darting toward the room, seeking both escape and reassurance. Miss Marple noted the subtle signs, the tightening of the jaw, the faint blanching of the skin, the restless shift of weight from foot to foot. The orchestrator was cornered, though not yet defeated. Miss Marple took a measured step forward, her voice softening, almost coaxing. "Lady Eleanor, we have seen the removal of the key and the envelope, the attack on Hargrove, the manipulation of reactions, and the carefully crafted misdirections. We understand the motive, the fear of exposure, the compulsion to control, the obsession with perception. You have gone to extraordinary lengths to maintain dominance and shield a secret, yet every action has left traces, subtle though they may be, that led us here." Lady Eleanor's composure finally broke. Her hands, previously folded tightly, began to tremble, and her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, shame, and defiance. I did not wish, I did not mean," she stammered, her voice quivering under the weight of exposure. "It was only to protect what my family has built, our honour, our reputation." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, almost gentle. "Indeed," she replied, "but the measures taken, removing evidence, orchestrating attacks, manipulating those around you, cannot be justified merely by fear. The consequences were serious, and yet they reveal the depth of your psychological compulsion. You acted not only to conceal, but to assert control, to maintain authority over both truth and perception." The room remained tense, each member of the household acutely aware of the unmasking taking place. Mrs. Fenwick's hands tightened around the edge of her chair, Clara's breath came in shallow, deliberate pulls, and Hargrove's eyes never left Lady Eleanor, comprehension dawning on him fully for the first time. For a moment, Lady Eleanor's gaze flickered toward the doors, a fleeting thought of escape passing across her face. Miss Marple, perceptive as ever, anticipated this movement. She subtly shifted her stance, cutting off potential paths and focusing attention entirely on the orchestrator. "There is no need for flight," she said softly, almost maternal in tone. "The truth has revealed itself, and acknowledgement is the only way to reconcile action with consequence. Attempting to evade reality now will only prolong distress and complicate matters further." Lady Eleanor's knees weakened, and she sank slowly into a chair, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her. The calculated, confident figure that had manipulated the household was replaced by a person laid bare, the internal obsession and fear exposed fully. I only wanted to protect. I feared everything would collapse, she whispered, voice breaking. I never wished anyone harm. Miss Marple nodded, the quiet authority of her presence guiding the confession and the release of tension. Your fears, though understandable in their source, became the driver of a series of calculated actions. Yet recognition, acknowledgement, and explanation are steps toward resolution. By understanding the depths of your motive, we understand the sequence of events, and can ensure that such manipulation ceases. A small, deliberate movement by Clara drew Miss Marple's attention. The young woman had reached for the envelope that had been recovered earlier, handing it gently to Hargrove, who inspected it and confirmed its intact contents. The black night on the mantel caught the faint light of the candles, reflecting shadows across the room as though mirroring the complex web that had just been untangled. Every detail, every object, every step had contributed to the final clarity. Lady Eleanor's tears continued, though now tinged with relief at having been understood and at having the manipulations acknowledged. I understand now, she whispered. I see how far I went, and how my fear shaped every step. I will accept what must follow. Miss Marple's gaze softened but remained focused. Acceptance is the first step toward resolution, she said. Understanding the hidden motive, the orchestration, and the effects of your actions allows us to restore equilibrium within Pendleton Hall. The pattern, once elusive, is now clear. The truth has emerged from shadows, and we proceed not with retribution, but with comprehension and careful rectification. The tension that had gripped the household eased incrementally. Even Hargrove, still wary from the assault, seemed to recognize the end of the orchestrators. Influence Mrs. Fenwick exhaled slowly, while Clara's posture relaxed, her wide eyes reflecting relief and comprehension. The danger had passed, the manipulations exposed, and the psychological complexity behind every action revealed in full. Miss Marple allowed a final pause, surveying the room. The candlelight reflected off the polished surfaces and gilded frames, catching subtle imperfections, much like the minute traces left by Lady Eleanor's meticulous planning. The orchestration has ended, she said quietly. The final act has been played, and every move, every misdirection, every hidden intent has been brought into the light. Pendleton Hall can now begin to heal, guided by understanding rather than fear, clarity rather than deception. Lady Eleanor lifted her head, eyes red but resolute, acknowledging both her actions and the detective's unerring insight. The confession had been compelled not by threat or intimidation, but by the quiet, unwavering clarity of Miss Marple's observation, the careful construction of evidence, and the patience that had guided her through the most intricate psychological puzzle of her career. In that calm, candle-lit room, the final confrontation concluded. The orchestrator's machinations had been laid bare, the hidden motives exposed, and the household left with the comprehension and resolution necessary to move forward. Miss Marple, composed and serene, allowed herself a quiet nod of satisfaction. The mystery that had gripped Pendleton Hall, confounding and perilous, had been unravelled, its final truth, subtle yet undeniable, now illuminating every shadowed corner of the estate. The calm that settled over Pendleton Hall after Lady Eleanor's confession was fragile, almost ceremonial. Candles flickered softly, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the polished wooden floors and ornate wallpaper as if the house itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, notebook closed and mind at work, allowed a quiet moment to absorb the atmosphere. The tension that had dominated the estate for weeks seemed to have eased, leaving only the soft hum of anticipation and residual unease. She had guided the household through revelations, psychological insight, and confession, but a subtle unease tickled the edges of her awareness. Something, she sensed, was unresolved. Hargrove, now seated at the table, carefully examined the envelope once again. The recovered papers had been authenticated, all correspondence and records accounted for, and yet Miss Marple noted a subtle tremor in his fingers, not from lingering injury but from doubt. Even Clara, who had visibly relaxed after Lady Eleanor's acknowledgement, seemed distracted, her gaze darting toward the east wing as if anticipating something hidden in the shadows. Mrs. Fenwick remained poised, but her otherwise steady hands occasionally twitched, betraying an underlying tension. Miss Marple rose, walking slowly across the drawing-room with measured steps. Her intuition, honed over decades of observation, whispered that the case, although apparently resolved, contained one final piece yet unseen. She paused by the mantel, allowing her gaze to fall upon the black knight chess piece, its presence familiar yet newly significant. The piece had been central to previous manipulations, but its subtle placement now seemed to convey a message she had only partially decoded. She traced a fingertip lightly along the edge, considering the trajectory of events and the behavioral responses she had catalogued meticulously. A sudden noise, a whisper of movement, barely audible, alerted her. The household remained still, but the sound came again, deliberate and precise, emanating from the corridor that led to the servant quarters. Miss Marple's heart did not race. She was practiced in controlling anticipation, yet she recognized the need to investigate immediately. Whoever, or whatever, was responsible for this subtle disturbance might be the final link in the chain she had been unraveling. She moved quietly toward the corridor, her eyes scanning shadows and subtle movements, her awareness heightened by every flicker of candlelight. Near the entrance to the east wing, she discovered a figure hastily retreating, a servant she had rarely observed, young and unassuming, who had seemed peripheral in every prior analysis. The servant froze, hands raised in feigned innocence, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected the telltale tension in posture, the slightest deviation in the gait, the nervous glance toward the library. "Edward," she called softly, using the servant's name, her voice carrying calm authority. "I believe you have something to explain." Edward's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face, yet he attempted to mask it with defiance. I don't understand, Miss Marple," he stammered. "I have done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's gaze, unwavering, followed his subtle reactions, the half-glance to the mantel, the slight dust displacement near the base of the Black Knight, the minuscule scuff marks leading toward the hidden cupboard beneath the library shelves. Her mind connected the threads instantly. The envelope had been returned, the key recovered, Lady Eleanor's confession secured, but the orchestrator's influence extended beyond these events. Edward, though previously unnoticed, had been acting with covert precision, manipulating small details, concealing evidence, and subtly guiding reactions, all in the background, while attention focused on Lady Eleanor. "You were present during every manipulation, Edward," Miss Marple said softly, taking a step closer. "You observed, you intervened, and you concealed elements of the orchestration. While Lady Eleanor's actions were motivated by fear and obsession, your interventions indicate deliberate planning, insight, and, dare I say, an agenda of your own. Tell me, what is your interest in these events?" Edward's defiance faltered, and a cold, measured calm replaced the initial panic. "Miss Marple, I am not the villain of the household," he said, voice low, steady, almost practiced. "But the patterns, the manipulations, yes, I observed. I ensured certain things occurred as they did, not from fear, not from obsession, but to protect myself from consequences that would have been unjust." Miss Marple's mind raced. His explanation, though partially plausible, contained the subtle markers of evasion. The movements in the library, the placement of minor objects, the subtle nudges that guided perceptions, these were not acts of mere self-preservation. They were consistent with someone who had an understanding of psychological manipulation and a desire to control outcomes without exposing themselves directly. She observed Edward's slight hesitation, the way his eyes flicked to Lady Eleanor, and the micro-expressions that betrayed awareness of unspoken truths. "And yet," she pressed, "the attack on Hargrove, the removal of key evidence, the calculated psychological tests, all of these occurred under your observation. You did not intervene directly even when harm was done. How do you reconcile that with the notion of protection?" Edward's jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his expression. "I acted where I could, without revealing myself, he admitted. It was not my place to confront Lady Eleanor directly, but I ensured certain discoveries were made, and some concealments remained to maintain balance. There are layers here you do not yet see, Miss Marple. Layers that involve not only fear and obsession, but legacy, pride, and survival. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind aligning the pieces. Edward's role, previously unseen, had been subtle, a background hand influencing outcomes while allowing the primary orchestrator to dominate attention. The final revelation was now apparent. The apparent resolution, Lady Eleanor's confession, and the recovered evidence represented only part of the truth. Edward's interventions had shaped perception, guided the household's understanding, and ensured the sequence of events followed a path that served both hidden and self-preservative ends. You were the silent architect, she said gently but firmly. You did not act for malice but for influence. Your manipulation of details, observation of behaviour, and strategic inaction all contributed to the unfolding of this drama. The crime, its resolution, and the perception of guilt all bear your imprint, alongside Lady Eleanor's. Edward's face paled, the recognition of exposure settling in. I never sought harm, Miss Marple, he said quietly. Only to guide, to prevent escalation, to ensure no injustice fell upon me, or those unaware of the deeper complexities. Miss Marple's gaze, sharp and precise, met his. Guidance, yes, but inaction, concealment, and selective intervention constitute. Influence, the case, is not as open and shut as it appeared. Your presence, subtle though it was, shaped the outcome. The final twist, Edward, is that the mind behind the orchestration extends beyond the surface-level villainy. It includes those who manipulate perception, conceal truths, and intervene selectively. Edward slumped slightly, understanding that the detective's insight had revealed the full depth of his involvement. So, the pattern was never only hers, he murmured. It was ours, inadvertently or otherwise. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed, the soft authority of her voice unwavering. The pattern was layered. Lady Eleanor's obsessive manipulations, Edward's subtle interventions, and the orchestrations of perception created a complex whole. Recognizing this final layer ensures that the mystery is fully understood, the psychology of actions clarified, and the household's equilibrium restored with knowledge, not illusion. The assembled household listened in stunned silence. Even Hargrove, who had suffered most directly, nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. Clara's eyes widened, her gaze flicking between Edward and Lady Eleanor, realizing that the seemingly straightforward resolution had concealed a final layer of subtle manipulation. Mrs. Fenwick's hands unclenched slightly, acknowledging the detective's final unravelling of events. Miss Marple allowed the moment to stretch, letting the revelation sink in. The final twist had tested her genius, but her patience, meticulous observation, and psychological acuity had uncovered the full scope of the orchestration. The mystery, intricate and multi-layered, was now fully revealed. A combination of fear, obsession, and subtle background influence, a delicate interplay of visible and invisible hands shaping events. The household, though shaken, began to breathe more freely. The final revelation had illuminated the remaining shadows, exposing both the primary orchestrator and the subtle interventions that had maintained the illusion of resolution. Miss Marple, serene and composed, allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. The case had demanded her full skill, patience, and insight. But at last, every layer had been uncovered, every hidden intention revealed, and Pendleton Hall could now, truly, begin to restore its fragile peace. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Pendleton Hall, casting a muted glow across the drawing-room. The events of the previous evening had left the household in a delicate equilibrium, relief mingled with lingering tension, understanding tempered by the knowledge that not everything had been as it seemed. Lady Eleanor sat quietly, composed, yet visibly shaken, while Edward, the unassuming servant whose interventions had shifted the entire narrative, appeared pensive, a faint shadow of guilt and relief crossing his face. The household had survived the revelation, but the air remained heavy with the lingering consequences of deception and hidden motives. Miss Marple, ever serene and precise, gathered the household with a quiet authority. Her presence demanded attention, not by force, but by the undeniable weight of her insight. "Yesterday," she began softly, "we uncovered the layers of manipulation, the hidden motives, and the subtle interventions that guided perception within Pendleton Hall. Lady Eleanor's obsession, Edward's concealed influence, and the minor manipulations throughout the estate all contributed to a narrative that was designed to mislead and control." She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room, observing the faint reactions of each person. Hargrove sat upright, still cautious, the trauma of the attack lingering but tempered by the clarity of understanding. Clara, young and impressionable, had recovered some composure, though her eyes betrayed the lingering shock of revelations she had only begun to process. Mrs. Fenwick's hands rested in her lap, fingers lightly intertwined, signalling both relief and the tension of having witnessed profound truths unveiled. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the mantel, lightly touching the black knight chess-piece. Its presence had been a subtle signal, a tool in the manipulation of perception and a marker of psychological influence. "This piece," she said gently, "was more than decoration. Its movement, placement, and the reactions it inspired were part of the larger pattern, a pattern that guided attention, elicited responses, and tested awareness. The missing envelope, the stolen key, and the incidents in the library were all interconnected, each reinforcing the web of control and misdirection." Lady Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her eyes. "I never realized the extent to which it all spiraled," she admitted softly. "I only sought to protect, but it seems I became a part of a far more dangerous design than I imagined." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is a common tendency for fear and obsession to magnify consequences. In your desire to control perception, to shield yourself and your family, you set in motion events that reached beyond immediate intent. And yet, it is crucial to recognize both the deliberate actions and the unintentional consequences, for together they form the complete narrative." She turned her attention to Edward, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Edward, your interventions were subtle yet significant. By observing, influencing, and occasionally withholding action, you became a silent architect of the unfolding events. Though your intention was preservation rather than harm, your actions were instrumental in shaping outcomes and delaying resolution." Edward nodded slowly, the weight of acknowledgement pressing upon him. "I never sought harm," he said quietly, "only to guide, prevent mistakes, and protect those unaware of the underlying forces at play." Miss Marple's gaze remained calm but unwavering. "And that, Edward, is why understanding subtlety, observation, and intent is as vital as recognizing overt actions. The apparent resolution last evening was only part of the truth. The final layer, your interventions, demonstrated that influence is not always visible, and the most important actions are often the ones unnoticed until carefully analyzed." She gestured toward Lady Eleanor once more. "Your confession was crucial, as was the acknowledgement of your fear and obsession. Yet the complexity of human behavior, particularly when layered with subtle manipulations, often creates outcomes that are difficult to predict and even harder to interpret without careful observation." Hargrove, who had been quiet until this point, spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. "So the crime, while driven by fear and obsession, was also shaped by Edward's subtle hand. In a sense, the final pattern was the product of two minds, one overt, one hidden, but both influencing events." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "And that is why every clue, every small detail that seemed insignificant, every micro-expression and faint movement, must be considered in understanding the full scope of a mystery. The removal of the key, the envelope, the positioning of objects, and even the offhand remarks that seemed trivial, all were threads in a tapestry that only becomes clear when examined in its entirety." A silence settled over the room, filled with the weight of comprehension. Yet, as the household reflected on the intricate web they had lived through, a subtle unease remained, a recognition that, while the immediate threats had been revealed and accounted for, the broader consequences of hidden manipulations could linger. Miss Marple's keen mind acknowledged this quietly. Resolution was achieved, justice had been administered in a sense, but human behaviour rarely conforms neatly to ideals of neat closure. Lady Eleanor, she continued gently, it is essential to recognise that while your actions were extreme, understanding, acknowledgement and the guidance of consequences allow for a form of justice that aligns with both the psychological and the tangible realities of this household. Yet, Edward, your role reminds us that influence can be invisible and resolution may not always be absolute. The patterns we uncover illuminate truths, but they do not erase human complexity or the capacity for unforeseen actions. The household absorbed the weight of her words. Lady Eleanor's tears had subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance, while Edward's posture suggested reflection and a measure of regret. Even Hargrove, though physically uninjured, appeared to understand that the events had left a permanent imprint, an acknowledgement that some mysteries, even when unravelled, carry consequences beyond immediate understanding. Miss Marple stepped back, allowing the light of the morning to fall upon her as she concluded. Justice has been served in the sense that actions have been revealed, motives understood, and responsibility acknowledged. Yet the case demonstrates a fundamental truth. Resolution is not solely about punishment or reward. It is about insight, recognition of subtlety, and the careful unravelling of intent. Every small clue, every overlooked detail, every seemingly minor action played a part in this narrative, and it is only through patient observation and thoughtful deduction that the full picture emerges. Clara, sitting quietly, finally spoke, her voice tinged with awe. Miss Marple, you saw everything, even what we couldn't see ourselves. The invisible threads, the hidden motives, they all make sense now. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, approving smile. Indeed, my dear, a mystery is never as simple as it appears on the surface. The unremarkable can reveal the extraordinary, and even the most subtle movements and minor actions can determine outcomes of profound significance. Understanding, patience, and careful observation, these are the tools that guide resolution and allow justice, in whatever form it may take, to be served. The household began to settle into a cautious calm, the shadows of recent events gradually yielding to a tentative sense of order. Yet beneath the surface, the lingering awareness remained that human complexity and subtle manipulation rarely vanish entirely. The mystery at Pendleton Hall had been unravelled, its hidden motives exposed, and its manipulations clarified, but the knowledge that even the smallest hand can shape outcomes left a lingering, sobering thought. The detective had been one step ahead, seeing the unseen, decoding the pattern, and ensuring that understanding prevailed over deception. Yet the faint unease, the recognition of residual influence, suggested that the story, while resolved in action, remained rich with the subtleties that define human nature. Miss Marple, serene and composed, allowed the moment to linger before stepping toward the door. Justice had been achieved in clarity and understanding, yet the house itself seemed to whisper a quiet reminder. Even when all is revealed, human intention, subtle influence, and the complexities of motive may leave shadows that endure, and it is precisely within those shadows that a detective's skill must shine brightest, anticipating, observing, and comprehending what others cannot see. The household, though shaken, felt the weight of clarity and the faint release of tension. Lady Eleanor, Edward, Clara, and Hargrove would carry the lessons of observation, motive, and consequence forward, forever marked by the meticulous unravelling of events. Miss Marple once again had proven the power of patience, perception, and insight, showing that even when justice appears served, understanding the hidden threads behind every action ensures that the truth, no matter how layered or subtle, remains firmly in view. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Pendleton Hall, bathing the drawing-room in a warm, honeyed light that belied the tension and turmoil of the preceding days. Outside, the gardens were quiet, the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call marking the slow return of peace. Within, however, the household remained subdued, still processing the cascade of revelations that had unfolded. Lady Eleanor's confession, Edward's subtle manipulations, and Miss Marple's patient unravelling of a mystery layered in fear, obsession, and cunning. Miss Marple stood near the window, gazing at the distant cliffs where sea spray caught the light, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The household had gathered for a final moment of reflection, though no words were required. The atmosphere itself carried the weight of what had transpired. Lady Eleanor sat quietly, pale and composed, though a faint tremor betrayed the remnants of her emotional ordeal. Edward lingered near the doorway, posture straight, face marked by contemplative sobriety, as if weighing the consequences of his subtle interventions. Clara and Mrs. Fenwick had resumed their ordinary places within the room, though their eyes betrayed a lingering unease, the recognition that even when events appear resolved, human complexity leaves traces that cannot be immediately erased. Miss Marple allowed a measured silence to stretch, letting her mind revisit the intricate sequence of events she had pieced together. Every stolen envelope, every removed key, every psychological manipulation had formed a chain. Yet, even with the apparent resolution, she sensed a subtle disturbance, an anomaly too small to be of immediate consequence, yet persistent enough to demand attention. Her gaze drifted to the black knight on the mantel, now seemingly benign, yet for some reason its presence felt heavier than it had the day before. A minor shift in its angle, imperceptible to anyone but her, suggested a small disturbance, a motion out of place, almost as if the piece were a silent witness to something yet undisclosed. She moved closer, crouching slightly to inspect the base, noting the faint scratch along the polished wood. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but it hinted at something deliberate, a minor interference perhaps, or a trace of an unseen hand. Her mind worked quickly, cataloguing possibilities. Had Edward adjusted it to conceal a minor clue, or was it left deliberately to signal a yet-to-be-revealed secret? The anomaly stirred that familiar thrill that preceded every case, the quiet insistence that, however fully a story may appear to conclude, a subtle question remains, teasing the mind and promising another layer just beyond immediate perception. The sound of soft footsteps brought Miss Marple's attention to the present. Hargrove approached, careful and measured, his eyes reflecting both weariness and the curiosity that had propelled him through the events. "Miss Marple," he said, voice low, "is it truly over? Can we be certain that nothing else lies beneath the surface?" She smiled faintly, the expression gentle yet knowing. "Mr. Hargrove, we have unravelled the main threads, revealed the hidden motives, and accounted for the manipulations. Lady Eleanor's actions, Edward's subtle interventions, and the psychological patterns have all been clarified. And yet," she paused, her gaze returning to the Black Knight, "the smallest details often carry secrets that escape immediate comprehension. Even in apparent resolution, there is room for curiosity, observation, and discovery. That is the nature of human behaviour, and, indeed, of mystery itself." Clara, lingering at the doorway, tilted her head in question, eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and wonder. "You mean there could still be something we haven't noticed? Even now?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm and enigmatic. "Indeed, my dear. Consider the scratch at the base of the Black Knight. It may be inconsequential, a minor accident, or it may indicate an adjustment, a deliberate placement, or a hidden message intended to be discovered later. It is impossible to determine without careful attention, and yet it serves as a reminder that resolution is rarely absolute. A mystery is seldom truly closed. It evolves, leaving subtle traces and questions that challenge the perceptive mind." Edward, standing near the mantel, shifted uncomfortably. His interventions had influenced events more than anyone had realized, yet even he now recognized the limits of certainty. "Are you suggesting," he asked cautiously, "that there might be another layer, another motive, or perhaps someone else entirely who remains unseen?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. "Possibly, Edward, but it is not always necessary for everyone to uncover every layer immediately. Some questions serve not to alarm, but to prompt reflection, to encourage attention to detail, and to cultivate the awareness that even the smallest anomaly may hold significance. The lingering question," she added, "is not a flaw in resolution, but an invitation to remain observant, to notice what is easily overlooked, and to recognize that the human mind, whether guided by fear, obsession, or subtle influence, is rarely predictable in its entirety. Lady Eleanor, sitting with her hands folded, regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of humility and quiet apprehension. So, even after everything, we cannot be certain that all is fully known? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. We can be confident in the understanding we have achieved, Lady Eleanor. The primary motives, manipulations, and consequences are clear, yet life and human nature always leaves room for nuance. That is the essence of mystery. There is always a shadow at the edge of perception, a detail that may hint at further revelations. Recognizing this ensures that vigilance, curiosity, and comprehension remain alive. As she spoke, a soft breeze drifted through the open window, causing the candle flames to flicker and the shadows to dance across the room. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to sweep the faces before her. The recognition of human complexity, the acknowledgement of subtle influence, and the acceptance of limitations in perception were all visible in their expressions. She understood the household's need for closure, yet she also knew that true insight required the patience to accept the lingering question, the unexplained detail, and the possibility that a new thread could emerge at any moment. With quiet composure, Miss Marple turned toward the door, her silhouette framed against the golden light of the afternoon. "It is time for me to take my leave," she said softly, the faint rustle of her skirts the only sound as she moved. Pendleton Hall has achieved clarity, insight, and understanding, and yet, as with all mysteries, there remains the potential for another revelation. Observe, question, and reflect. Even when a story appears complete, the smallest detail may yet suggest another chapter. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at the room one last time. The black night glimmered faintly in the candlelight, and she allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. A cryptic feeling, an almost imperceptible intuition tugged at her mind. Perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps it was the first whisper of another unfolding enigma. Either way, the lure of discovery, the thrill of unraveling human intention, and the subtle shadows of perception would continue to beckon. As she stepped down the corridor and toward the gates, Miss Marple felt the familiar rush of anticipation, the quiet assurance that, though the immediate events of Pendleton Hall had been revealed, the world was still rich with mysteries waiting to be observed, analyzed, and understood. The case that had consumed weeks of her attention was closed in action, yet open in spirit, a gentle reminder that the pursuit of truth is never finite, and that the mind attuned to observation will always find a new thread to follow. Outside, the gardens were tranquil, yet the faint rustle of leaves seemed almost conspiratorial, as if the house itself had secrets yet to whisper. Miss Marple walked steadily down the path, knowing that she had guided Pendleton Hall through revelation, confession, and understanding, but also aware that one tiny detail, one subtle anomaly, might yet emerge to challenge the mind, to provoke curiosity, and to hint at another story waiting in the wings. She smiled quietly to herself. The mystery never truly ends. It simply waits for the next careful observer to notice its whisper.